Okay, recording. Okay, we are in week 8. I was telling Scott, I was amazed we could do 8 weeks of Jacob and still, and more to come, and also it seems like every week sort of a cliffhanger. And remember, we're studying the life of Jacob to understand the phrase that we've heard all our lives, the God of our fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We're studying this to understand. We learned a couple of weeks ago or last week that Jacob was given a new name, Israel. We know that Jacob had 12 sons and there's 12 tribes of Israel, and we'll find out as time goes on how all of that comes to bear. And it's not as easy to think he had 12 sons and those are the 12 names of the tribes, because if any of you cheated and went ahead, they're not all the same 12 names. So you want to know why. And I think the lesson today, and you hear a lot about perseverance and also God's timing, not our timing. And when I always bring up the idea that sometimes we miss when we read the Bible just one section at a time and don't read an entire story, we miss the idea of how much time has passed. And today I think we'll see some of that. Do you guys have something to add?
No, except that this promise that God has made to Abraham carried down to Isaac and then explicitly to Jacob. I'll give you this land. When you go away, I'll bring you back. And we see through these stories and through others that it's almost like a movie. Just when you think the hero is about to, how can he get out of this mess? God provides a way. They get, through the years, they get hauled off, they get brought back. In this case, God has made provision for them in this very long story. And so you see this continuing promise that God has made to them being brought back and brought back and brought back. And this is one of the really incredible examples of it. So
we forgot one thing. We went to Arkansas for a week.
We'll show them at the end.
Oh, okay.
We've got some pictures. If you can hang around at the end, we'll show you some pictures.
Okay. So where we left off, Jacob's had a favorite son, and his favorite son was Joseph. And Joseph was Jacob's favorite, and one of the reasons he was Jacob's favorite is he was with his favorite, the first son of his favorite wife, Rachel. And he had just been, the brothers were jealous of him. He had that colorful coat, and his father made it clear that he was his favorite. He was sold. They were going to put him in a pit. They did put him in a pit. They took him out of the pit and decided to sell them to the Midianites that were going down to Egypt. No, what did I say?
Ishmaelites,
but they're also the
Midianites. That's
yes,
true.
The Midianites, and the Midianites ended up selling them at the very last sentence we read last week. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, who is an officer of Pharaoh and a captain of the guard. So that's where we left off. And so today's study is going to be focusing on Joseph, which is Jacob's favorite son. We are going to skip chapter 38, and that is because Judah, who's another one of Jacob's son, it tells him about his life and about Tamar. Do you want to say something briefly about that?
Yeah, briefly, because we did skip the whole thing. This is really about Jacob and the lineage through Joseph. But one of the sons, Judah, and that's one of the 12 tribes, there's this whole sordid affair that goes on. But he winds up, there winds up being a child conceived by a woman named Tamar, who was a prostitute, who prostituted herself.
She was also his daughter-in-law.
She was his daughter-in-law, and she did what she winds up doing is prostituting herself, and that's how she conceived the child. Very strange story, but it is kind of a thing that this is the lineage of Jesus. Jesus came from the tribe of Judah, and we saw we saw in the book of Ruth, Ruth was a Moabite, so she's a foreigner, and Tamar is a prostitute. And there are all these people, they're Gentiles in the lineage of the Messiah. And it's not this, pristine thing that you might think of. And I don't think that's an accident either. We'll talk about it, but that's what 38 was. So we'll move on to Jacob or Joseph.
Yes, so chapter 39 of Genesis. Meanwhile, Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, where an Egyptian named Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and a captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, serving in the household of his Egyptian master.
You mind if I put in something real quick? He becomes successful serving in the house of his Egyptian master. And if you remember some weeks back, Paul was telling people, if you're a slave, serve well. If you're a believer, serve well, represent the faith well. And this is before the time of Jesus, but you still see, and we saw it with Daniel when we did that study. They wind up being carried off. They wind up becoming slaves. I mean, this is a literal slave, but he serves well and he's successful in that role. And instead of becoming angry, instead of becoming bitter, he gets to work and is rewarded for it. It's an interesting thing, and it's not unique to Paul. We see it all the way back here.
When his master saw that the Lord was with him and made him prosper in all he did, Joseph found favor in his sight and became his personal attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household and entrusted him with everything he owned. From the time he put Joseph in charge of his household and all that he owned, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's household on account of him. The Lord's blessing was on everything he owned, both in his house and in his field. So Potiphar left all that he owned in Joseph's care. He did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. Now Joseph was well built and handsome. And after some time, his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph and said, "Sleep with me." When he refused, "Look," he said to his master's wife, "with me here, my master does not concern himself with anything in his house, and he has entrusted everything he owns to my care. No one in this house is greater than I am. He has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. So how could I do such a great evil and a sin against God?" Although Potiphar's wife spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be near her. One day, however, Joseph went into the house to attend to his work, and not a single household servant was inside. She grabbed Joseph by his cloak and said, "Sleep with me." But leaving his cloak in her hand, he escaped and ran outside. They think the Old Testament is boring.
It's not as sanitized as a lot of people like to think. And first of all, you see that Joseph is successful and he works hard. But the thing that it's easy to miss is that God's hand was with him. God blessed the Egyptian on account of Joseph. I mean, Joseph's a hard worker, but I know a bunch of hard workers who don't, what did Solomon say? The race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong. I mean, a lot of the time, people they work hard, but they don't become this successful. God's hand is on this, and he is so successful that this master of his just quits worrying about anything. I don't have to worry about anything, and that shows a lot of faith that he doesn't even have to oversee him. I would not fail to oversee construction workers in Rockport, for instance. I would not turn things over. What we go through with that. He turns everything over, and the only thing he has to worry about is the food he's going to eat. But then it says his wife says he is well built and handsome. He is a good looking guy. And the wife happens to look over one day and says, hey, and I read commentaries of people who think this is sort of a far-fetched plot twist. But you remember in the movie To Kill a Mockingbird, in the book, where that girl sees the man walking by and she says, would you come in and bust up this old shiffer robe for me? We don't think that's a far-fetched plot twist. That's exactly what she was doing. And so in this case, once again, I just like you to see that even if this sounds odd, it doesn't strain our credibility in other situations. So he says no, and then he makes sure not to get alone with her, not to be in her presence. He doesn't leave himself vulnerable to a situation. He knows this is going to lead to no good. But when she
It's
said,
estimated from figuring out where we started and everything, he's probably about 17 years old at this time, to give you an idea. So he's a young, strapping, handsome guy.
but what he does say is, he tells her, look, Potiphar trusts me with everything. He has literally given me control of everything he has. He doesn't second guess me. He trusts me with his household. I'm not going to do that to him. It would be a terrible thing. And he says, how could I do such a terrible thing to God, to Yahweh? And so first he says, just in general, this would be a really dumb thing for me to do. The only thing he has withheld from me is you, because you're his wife. And you're going to tell me to violate that one thing. And I couldn't help but think, the Genesis creation story, they're in the garden and they are given everything except one thing. And that's the one thing they have to have. And this would be the perfect situation for Joseph to do something like that. But he tells her, I've been trusted with this. It would be a dumb thing to do. And how could I do such a thing before God? He never seems to leave that behind. We're going to see it again here in a little bit. But finally, one day he comes in to do some work and all the other servants are gone. And I can't help but think she sent him away. And she,
We heard one commentary that he should have left them when he saw that that was Joseph's fault.
he should,
I'm just thinking, okay.
anyway, she puts the move on him and grabs him, and he jerks away and he leaves his cloak. And we're see what's going to happen with that. But he makes a point of trying not to be there because this is what's going to happen.
When she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and had run out of the house, she called her household servants. Look, she said, this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came to me so he could sleep with me, but I screamed as loud as I could. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house. So Potiphar's wife kept Joseph's cloak beside her until his master came home. Then she told him the same story. The Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me, but when I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house. When his master heard the story, his wife told him, saying, this is what your slave did to me. He burned with anger. So Joseph's master took him and had him thrown into prison where the king's prisoners were confined.
So the expression hell hath no fury like a woman scorned, it probably is written about this. But this is the thing. And the funny thing is, it's so much like that scene in To Kill a Mockingbird. After he, turns her down, then she spins this yarn about how he attacked her. This, I'm sure has been repeated other times through history. But Potiphar, you see Potiphar's reaction, and she keeps the cloak right there. So the moment he shows up, look, I've got his cloak. He was here. I screamed and he ran away. But and Potiphar burns with anger. That Joseph who could have seen that coming? Joseph knew he was entrusted with everything except his wife. This is why he knew it was a
And we
bad
didn't
thing.
explain who Potiphar was.
He's the head of Pharaoh's guard, probably his personal bodyguard, the palace guards. And you see that he has Joseph thrown in a prison that's reserved for the king's prisoners. He is more than high ranking. I mean, he is very, very close under Pharaoh, but he has him thrown in prison. And this is not a place. And somebody mentioned this week, these are not like our prisons where they have TVs and beds and stuff. This is a rough place.
While Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him and extended kindness to him, granting him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. And the warden put all the prisoners under Joseph's care, so that he was responsible for all that was done in prison. The warden did not concern himself with anything under Joseph's care, because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did.
And we see it like Daniel. We see these places where, but don't lose sight of the fact, Joseph, I know is a hard worker. I know he's diligent, but it says God's hand is on him. Go back to the beginning where we talk about the long plan. This is the lineage of the Messiah. We started this study with pointing that out. This family, starting with Abraham, is the lineage of God's Messiah who will reconcile humanity to himself. And so his hand is on these people at every turn. And so Joseph gets in, and he is so useful that the prison warden, the head guy of the prison, also gets to kick back and not worry about anything. It's like a trustee, he turns everything over to him, and he gets to, sit back and watch TV all day. But Joseph is blessed by God. He's very successful.
It's easy to say Joseph was a born leader, and that idea of born leader, or because of being blessed by God.
That's the piece we want to take away from this part of the story. Don't forget that. There are lots of born leaders. These are exceptional circumstances. God's hand is on him, and it's because this is a part of the deliverance that's to come. And actually what we'll see is this accomplishes something that would have been hard to accomplish any other way. So even though Joseph is in what seems like a bad place, I think he's still confident that God is with him.
And the fact that you see that confidence because he didn't spend time thinking, hey, I was just put in prison for something I didn't do. And like I said, he's probably 17, late teens, early 20s at this time. And can you imagine being put into a prison and not have done what you were accused of?
How easy would it be to become bitter, right? To say, you know what, I got kidnapped, I got hauled off, sold into slavery, and then I worked my way up and got knocked down again by this woman accusing me of something I didn't do, and just get bitter and angry. And instead he goes right back to work. Chapter
40. Sometimes later, the king's cupbearer and the baker offended their master, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and imprisoned them in the house of the captain of the guard, the same prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he became their personal attendant. After they had been in custody for some time, both of these men, the Egyptian king's cupbearer and baker, who were being held in prison, had a dream on the same night, and each dream had its own meaning.
So the cupbearer, that seems like a silly job to just hand a cup of wine to a guy. But you also have to remember that these kings and emperors in that time, there's always somebody looking to take their place, and they had to worry about being poisoned. And so I think that cupbearer probably also means not only is he the wine steward, but he's probably the wine taster. And he makes sure that what gets handed to Pharaoh hasn't been poisoned. So it's kind of an important trusted position. We don't know. There's no telling how the baker and the cupbearer offended Pharaoh. It's not that hard to do. It's hot in Egypt, and on those hot summer days, you take offense at a lot of stuff. We don't know. But he throws him in this prison for offending him, for getting on his nerves. And because Joseph is in charge of everything, he gets put in charge of them as well. And they have dreams. And not today, but we're going to talk about these dreams. They're dreams that you recognize are more than just, the normal ramblings that go on in our sleep. And they both have dreams on the same night.
And remember, Joseph, he interprets, or he has dreams. Joseph has dreams, and that's sort of what got him in trouble to begin with. He told about his dreams to his brothers and his father, and that's how his brothers ended up getting jealous of him in the first place. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were distraught. So he asked the officials of Pharaoh, who were in custody with them in his master's house, "Why are your faces so downcast today?" "We both had dreams," they replied, "but there's no one to interpret them." Then Joseph said to them, "Don't interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." So the chief cupbearer told Joseph his dream. "In my dream, there was a vine before me, and on the vine there were 3 branches. As it budded, its blossoms opened, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, squeezed them into his cup, and placed the cup in his hand." Joseph replied, "This is the interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore your position. You will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you did when you were his cupbearer. But when it goes well for you, please remember me and show me kindness by mentioning me to Pharaoh, that he might bring me out of this prison. For I was kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing for which they should have put me in this dungeon."
So they both have these dreams that they feel like have a meaning. They're very specific, and they're odd enough that they think it has meaning. And you notice what Joseph says. First of all, he notices that they're downcast. He noticed that something is troubling them. And I talk about that periodically, that we don't always pay attention to certain people. They're in prison. But yeah, I was at Walmart a few weeks ago, and there's a woman there that is a greeter. And I could just see from her face, I could see from her bearing that something was wrong. We don't always pay attention. But Joseph, and she had health problems. That was what that was. But Joseph notices them, and he says, what's the problem? And they say they've had these dreams. And his response is, "Don't interpretations come from God? Tell me your dreams." And he is letting them know that God will provide the interpretation. But also he's saying, and I talk to him often, so I think he'll give me the interpretation. He doesn't make it sound like he's going to do it on his own to get the attention. This is kind of an important distinction. And the dream about the 3 branches and the grapes, Joseph says, well, good news. The branches are days. You're going to be restored to your position with Pharaoh within 3 days. And he says, and now you may not have read it yet, but the one thing I would ask is, when you get out of here, and you are going to get out of here, remember me. Tell Pharaoh about me, because I'm here because I was hauled away and kidnapped. And now I'm in prison because of something I didn't do. I'm an innocent man. When you get back, tell Pharaoh about me.
And I do a quiz to Jean here. It says in verse 14, "But when it goes well for you, please remember me and show me kindness." Hesed. Back to Hesed, that word that shows up. And so
I guess not everybody has been through these classes, but I keep saying, and it shows up over and over and over and over again. In the Old Testament, this Hebrew word has said, it is kindness, it is grace, it is a gift that is from someone more powerful to someone less powerful that cannot be repaid. And he says, remember to show me the same has said that I've shown you. One other thing I didn't mention, he says, when you get out, Pharaoh will lift up your head. Okay. Earlier, when Jacob was sending those people out to kind of soften Esau up, he says, hopefully he will find favor with me. But the actual Hebrew term is, he will lift up my head. And that has to do with someone who's either ashamed or humbled and looking down. And the person says, you know, look at me, lift up your head, be confident that everything is okay. There's a place in the New Testament where Peter and I think it's James come into a city, and there's a man there begging. He wants some money. And they tell him, look at us, lift up your head. That indicates he's doing this. He's one of those, he's a beggar, he's destitute, and he won't look people in the eye. So this idea of lifting up someone's head, of giving them the respect and the confidence to say, you know, you can look me in the eye, no small thing. And so when he tells this cupbearer, when you get out, Pharaoh will lift up your head and give you your job back.
When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was favorable, he said to Joseph, I too had a dream. There were 3 baskets of white bread on my head. In the top basket were all sorts of baked goods for the Pharaoh, but the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head. Joseph replied, this is the interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and hang you on a tree. Then the birds will eat the flesh of your body. On the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he held a feast for all his officials, and in their presence, he lifted up the heads of the cupbearer and the chief baker. Pharaoh restored the chief cupbearer to his position so that he once again placed the cup in the Pharaoh's hand. But the Pharaoh hanged the chief baker, just as Joseph had described to them in his interpretation. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot all about him.
So the cupbearer gets this great interpretation of his dream, and I'm sure the baker said, oh, this is good. I had one that's almost like that. And it's not good news for him. And he says, he's going to lift up your head to put a noose around it. You're done. And this, you know, obviously is unpleasant news. And it comes to pass just like what Joseph had, the interpretation he'd been given, that the baker's head gets lifted up, a noose gets put around it. You notice though that the dream comes to the cupbearer, and it's about grapes and wine. And the dream comes to the chief baker, and it's about baskets of bread. And this comes up often too, that God talks to us in the way that we are capable of hearing. It's not coincidence. And we'll see that other times. You'll remember in some of the other studies, when John begins his gospel and says, in the beginning was the Logos, he talks to them about a Greek sort of belief and relates to people in terms that they're familiar with. So anyway, the baker is hanged, the cupbearer gets his job back, but I guess he's so excited at being brought out of prison, and he probably says, you know, that could be me hanging up there. He was so excited, he completely forgets about Joseph wasting away in prison.
Chapter 41.
Is there anything on the similarities of the 2 dreams about lifting your head?
Okay.
One is fantastic, the other one gets hung.
Let's
Same conclusion.
See if I can turn that up next time, maybe you'll be able to hear. It is, Gene, there's no doubt these 2 dreams, we're told they come on the same night. And we're supposed to understand that these are related. These are not, I mean, these are part of the story. It comes through on the same night. They're very similar dreams. And then when it says lift up your head, that's kind of an interesting play on things that your head, you're gonna be lifted up to be able to have your job back. The other one's head is lifted up to put a noose around. Is there anything more to it than that? I don't think so, but I don't know.
What I'm hearing is, don't try to be God yourself. You're gonna lift your head. Those are words that everybody's hearing. Joseph to the world, and we still have it today,
Sure.
beggar, da, 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 da. But it doesn't mean always a good ending,
That's true.
because you're not God. That's God's interpretation. Back to the line, don't dream too long, to God's interpretation.
Well, and yeah, and it is an interpretation. It's important to remember. It is something, words given to Joseph. This is God's interpret. I mean, God says this is what's going to happen. And he says it will come to pass. And it does. And that I think the real importance of this is the fact that it happens just like he tells Joseph, becomes important in the next part of this.
After 2 full years had passed, so he forgot to tell him anything, and it's 2 more years that Joseph is in this prison. After 2 full years had passed, Pharaoh had a dream. He was standing beside the Nile when 7 cows, sleek and well fed, came up from the river and began to graze among the reeds. After them, 7 other cows, sickly and thin, came up from the Nile and stood beside the well-fed cows on the bank of the river. And the cows that were sickly and thin devoured the 7 sleek, well-fed cows. Then Pharaoh woke up, but he fell back asleep and dreamed a second time. 7 heads of grain, plump and ripe, came up on one stalk. After them, 7 other heads of grain sprouted, thin and scorched by the east wind. And the thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 plump, ripe ones. Then Pharaoh awoke and realized it was a dream. In the morning, his spirit was troubled, so he summoned all the magicians and wise men of Egypt. Pharaoh told them his dream, but no one could interpret them for him.
This is almost exactly like Daniel. You remember he'd been carried off to Babylon, and the king has this dream repeatedly, and it troubles him. These are the kind of dreams that are not normal dreams, and it means something, but he doesn't know what it is. And this is by design once again, but you notice he has 2. And you'd ask a minute earlier, the idea that there were 2 dreams, even though they're by 2 different people, we're told later that it gets repeated as an indication that God has said this will come to pass. I don't know how you know that, but I know that's what it says. But he has this dream of these cows that come from the Nile. They come up out of the river, and they're, I don't know.
How did that
You
happen?
hit the mouse or something?
That was a message.
Yeah.
There we go.
Anyway, they're grazing, and they're fat and sleek and I mean just perfect specimens. And then these ugly, sickly cows come up, and they devour the fat, good-looking, sleek cows. Now, I don't know how that happens, except this is a dream. And what we'll talk about at a later time is that in these dreams, a lot of the time, this is symbolic. It doesn't, I'm sure it doesn't look like, Attack of the Killer Cows, but that's the what happens is that these sickly ones devour the fat ones, and nobody could tell the difference. After consuming these sleek, fat cows, they don't grow fat themselves. They're still sickly and skinny. You can't even tell they've consumed them. It's a strange dream. And then he has a very similar dream with the the stalks of grain, and the sickly ones that spring up, and they devour the fat ones, and nothing changes.
Is there something about the idea of dreams, by definition, are symbolic?
These kind typically are. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. And I will tell you, I'm not going to do it today, but I will make a point of doing this. But they, you know, just like Daniel, when he interpreted the dream, the statue with the different, you know, the body of bronze and the legs of iron, they represent something. And that's where Joseph's saying, don't interpretations belong to God. These are dreams sent by God. Who else could interpret them? That's the message.
Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, "Today I recall my failures. Pharaoh was once angry with his servants, and he put me and the chief baker in the custody of the captain of the guard. One night, both the cupbearer and I had dreams. Both the chief baker and I had dreams, and each dream had its own meaning. Now a young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he interpreted them for us individually. And it happened to us just as he interpreted. I was restored to my position, and the other man was hanged." So Pharaoh sent for Joseph, who was quickly brought out of the dungeon. After he was shaved and changed his clothes, he went in before Pharaoh.
And, you know, there are little things that are included in this, but the cupbearer, when he realizes Pharaoh has had this dream, and he calls in all of his magicians as advisors, his wise men, very much like Daniel once again, and nobody can interpret it. And he goes, "Hey, wait a minute. I messed up. I was supposed to tell you about this guy. I know a guy who does this. And we had these dreams, and he interpreted them, and everything came to pass just like he told us it would. I know a guy." And of course, Pharaoh says, "Well, I've tried everything else. Bring him up." Joseph has to stop and clean up and dress properly and shave. And someone brought up this week, and it's true, the Egyptians they were clean cut. They did not think you should have a beard, and they were sort of fanatic about it. So he had to get properly attired to come before Pharaoh before he could show up.
Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I had a dream, and no one can interpret it, but I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it." "I myself cannot do it," Joseph replied, "but God will give Pharaoh a sound answer."
This is huge. This, you know, I mentioned it earlier when he does in the dungeon, he does this same sort of thing. Pharaoh calls up and says, "I've been told that if you hear a dream, you can interpret dreams." And Joseph is very quick to say, "I can't do it. God will give you a fair interpretation of it. It's not going to be me." This is no small thing to be able to remember. And long ago, we did a study that was in James, where he advises people, don't say, "I'm going to go to this other city for a year and I'm going to trade and get rich and come back." You always remember that if God is willing, I'll do this. And it's a good reminder. And what you see Joseph doing here is making a point that when this is successful, he's not taking credit for it. He's not raising his hand and saying, because people love to get attention. I mean, we love recognition, and he could just as easily have done it that way. It wouldn't have worked out the same.
Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "In my dream, I was standing on the bank of the Nile when 7 cows, well fed and sleek, came up from the river and began to graze among the reeds. After them, 7 other cows, sickly, ugly, and thin, came up. I have never seen such ugly cows in all the land of Egypt. Then the thin, ugly cows devoured the 7 well-fed cows that were there first. When they had devoured them, however, no one could tell that they had done so. Their appearance was as ugly as it had been before. Then I awoke. In my dream, I also saw 7 heads of grain, plump and ripe, growing on a single stalk. After them, 7 other heads of grain sprouted, withered, thin, and scorched by the east wind. And the thin heads of grain swallowed the 7 plump ones. I told this dream to the magicians, but no one could explain it to me. At this, Joseph said to Pharaoh, "The dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he's about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 ripe heads of grain are 7 years. The dreams have the same meaning. Moreover, the 7 thin, ugly cows that came up after are 7 years, and so are the 7 worthless heads of grain, scorched by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine. It is just as I said to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh that what he is about to do. Behold, 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt, but 7 years of famine will follow them. Then all the abundance of the land of Egypt will be forgotten, and the famine will devastate the land. The abundance in the land will not be remembered, since the famine that swallowed it will be so severe. Moreover, because the dream was given to Pharaoh in 2 versions, the matter has been decreed by God, and he will carry it out shortly."
So, and I kind of skipped ahead. I do that a lot, but he repeats the dreams, and Joseph gives this interpretation. You remember I mentioned that the cupbearer has a dream about grapes and wine. The baker has a dream about baskets of bread and the birds eating it. Pharaoh is in charge of the land. The cows, I don't know for sure, and there's a point later on where he puts the Israelites in charge of his cattle. And it may be that all the cattle belong to him, but certainly the grain harvest, the cattle, these are the matters that are Pharaoh's, they're the kings. And so each one of these dreams is about something that person can relate to. And of course, it's pretty obvious what he says is, you're going to have 7 years of incredible abundance. And then when this famine comes for 7 years, it's going to be so severe, everyone will forget about the 7 good years. This is going to be bad. And that's with the cows. Remember, the lean cows eat the fat ones, and there's no evidence of it. The lean cows don't get fat. They just stay lean. This is going to be a bad famine. And he does tell him, as I said before, it's repeated twice to say that God has decreed it's going to come to pass, and it's going to come to pass soon.
Now therefore, Pharaoh, yes.
Susan, is that part of the 2 witness idea?
I don't think so.
Said twice.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I couldn't find any reference other than Joseph says, this is what it means. It's repeated twice. And it says, God is saying, if it was 1, sometimes people get warnings, and there's a chance, he says, unless you repent, bad things will happen. But this is one of those, there's no repentance, there's no nothing, it's gonna happen. And somehow Joseph is aware that that's what this means. I don't know.
Now therefore, Pharaoh should look for a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh take action and appoint commissioners over the land to take 1/5 of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. Under the authority of Pharaoh, let them collect all the excess food from these good years, that they may come and lay up the grain to be preserved as food in the cities. The food will be a reserve for the land during the 7 years of famine to come upon the land of Egypt. Then the country will not perish in the famine.
So this famine is coming. He's telling him this is a sure and certain thing. You're going to have the 7 good years. You need to, because it's going to happen soon. This thing is going to start. You need to get busy. You need a plan, and you need to appoint someone to oversee it. You're Pharaoh. You already have your hands full. This needs to be a person who's managing provisions for dealing with this famine that's coming. You need to set them over all of this, and then you need to appoint commissioners in the, in the different regions. And you're going to take 20% of the grain harvest. It's going to be bumper years. Normally 20% would be considered a harsh burden. It's a double tithe. Remember, a tithe is 10%. So 20% is a double tithe. And when you conquer another country and you force them to pay tribute, the tithe is a real common thing, 10%. This is double that on your own people. But it's not a punishment. You need to get about this. You need to get about it now, because it's the only way you're going to survive. Then the country will not perish during these 7 harsh years.
This proposal pleased Pharaoh, excuse me, and all his officials. So Pharaoh asked them, "Can we find anyone like this man in whom the Spirit of God abides?" Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one as discerning and as wise as you. You shall be in charge of my house, and all my people are to obey your commands. Only with regard to the throne will I be greater than you."
Real quick, that getting the interpretation is one thing. You're going to have 7 marvelous bumper crop years, and then you're going to have 7 years of famine. It's one thing to say that. It's another thing to say, this is what you need to do about it. And this world is lacking in that often. We have people who can see problems, but special people say, this is how you deal with it. This is what, and you need to get it in gear. So Pharaoh hears this and he says, well, you seem to be the one that God talks to. You're a wise guy. Can we think of anybody better than you to take this position? Was Joseph hinting at that? I don't know. Did he get given the words, to say that put him in this position? But he says, you seem to be the one who understands this. I nominate you. And he says, I'm going to put you in charge of everything. This is the 3rd time that Joseph has been in this position. I'm going to put you in charge, and only in the throne will I be greater than you. This is not a small thing either. He's saying, I'm not going to second guess you. I'm not going to be back here telling you what to do. You're going to be in charge. And this week we're laughing. We talked about this as we're driving. But if you know the Dallas Cowboys, every time they hire a head coach, the owner takes over and tells him what to do. And they can't get a head coach to come in. And they lose a lot because the owner wants to be the one running things. And what Pharaoh has said is, I'm not going to do that to you. This is yours. And you're going to be in charge. And I'm still going to be your boss, but you're running things. That's a rare level of confidence. But what he recognizes, this dream was important. It bothered him greatly. So it really left a mark. And he's convinced that Joseph is right. This famine is going to be a bad thing. He's actually pretty wise. He's smart to recognize he does need to put someone in charge, and it probably should be the guy that God talks to.
I think it's amazing when you think about the 7, if God had just, or if Joseph had just said, there's about to be a famine and it's going to start right now, that would be one thing. But there's going to be 7 years of a bumper crop. Just think of our world, 7 years of everything going right, and then things are going to go wrong. Like anybody would worry about something going wrong 7 years from now. They would just take advantage of the 7+ years, the abundant years.
You were going to say, Gene?
Yeah. Joseph says to Pharaoh, it's not me, it's God, interpreting the dream.
Yes.
2 or 3 sentences later, Pharaoh says, God is talking to you. Are we talking about the same God from the Pharaoh perspective than from the Jewish?
Funny you should ask that. And we talked about it this week. Do they have the same perception of the one God? And we really don't know. They use El, which is more of a generic term for God and not Yahweh. So is he thinking the same thing? He knows that Joseph got the interpretation and Joseph credits God, and that's all we're really told. I think it's probably enough. But you think about this as the Roaring Twenties, right? You remember everything is good, happy days are here again. They're spending money like, they're giving stuff away and everything is great. And when it's like that, people go nuts. And then suddenly there's 1929 and there's a Great Depression afterwards. And they say in the Great Depression, nobody had any money and there was nothing to buy if you did. That's what's going on here. Pharaoh, though, recognizes, and part of that is the testimony of the cupbearer. Had Joseph not been in that prison and the cupbearer had not seen this in action, he wouldn't have had the introduction. I mean, all of this stuff works together and it it's the right place at the right time. And you see God's providence, you see his hand in it. And so he says, I'm going to give you, did he already say the signet ring?
No. Pharaoh also told Joseph, I hereby place you over all the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh removed the signet ring from his finger, put it on Joseph's finger, clothed him in garments of fine linen, and placed a gold chain around his neck. He had Joseph ride in the second chariot with men calling out before him, bow the knee. So he placed him over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh declared to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, but without your permission, no one in all the land of Egypt shall lift his hand or foot. Pharaoh gave Joseph the name, you
Do
say
whatever.
it. I can't even say that. And he gave him Asenath, daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, to be his wife. And Joseph took charge of all the land of Egypt.
So he has put this outsider, this Hebrew, in charge of everything. And Mary said, well, wouldn't the locals resent that? Probably. They probably would. They were probably smart enough not to say it out loud, because when Pharaoh makes a decree, it stands. But what Pharaoh does is give him the signet ring. And a signet ring is a ring with a design on it. And they, in different parts in history, they would use clay, but they would also use wax. But they would take something soft and they would mash the ring into it. And that would be the king's seal. Its signet is from the same root as signature. That's the king's signature. That's his stamp, if you will. And that says that Joseph can make contracts. He can create documents. Is it time? And he's speaking with my authority. Joseph, when he makes a contract and he signs it with the ring, it's just like Pharaoh did it himself. This is a huge amount of authority. And he reminds him, I'm still the king. I mean, don't get too full of yourself. I still run the show, but I'm not going to get in your way. You're going to run things unless, of course, I have to step in. But then he gives him a new name. We've talked about new names, but he gives him an Egyptian name, probably to kind of give him more credibility with the locals, with the
And it
Egyptians.
does say that it probably means revealer of mysteries or God speaks and lives.
That's the probable meaning of the Egyptian name. But then he also gives him an Egyptian wife. And that sort of, if you look at the wisdom in that, that sort of cements Joseph as not being an outsider anymore. And
he's no longer a slave now.
he is definitely no longer a slave. He, just like Daniel, he is second only to the emperor, only to the king. He is the most powerful man in the land of Egypt. And this is quite a turnaround. But the Egyptian wife also ties him to Egypt. I mean, you understand that. This is wise on the part of Pharaoh to do things this way. But there was one other thing I was going to mention here. It's time to quit. Potipharah, this daughter of Potipharah. Remember, he had been the servant, the slave of Potiphar. And this says he gives the daughter of this Potipharah. And a lot of people just insist that's the same person. We don't know, but I don't think it is. They look a lot alike, but you got to remember a lot of the time, these names are based on something. And so if Poti means something, then Potiphar, oh, that's the way Hebrew names are. Potiphar is one person, Potipharah, but Potipharah is the high priest of On, which is one of their gods. And he gives his daughter to Joseph as a wife. So this also elevates Joseph. It's not just some common slave girl. This is the daughter of one of the big high priests. Joseph has been made an adopted Egyptian now.
I'm going to read one more line before, and then you can show pictures. And this idea, the next line says, when this happened, now Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. So this did not happen overnight, you guys. They think he was 17 when he was put in prison, and now he is 30 years old. So this has been 13 years.
Yep. Yeah, it took time for God's plan to come to fruition. And Joseph stayed busy and didn't become bitter or angry or any of those things. So we're going to show, if you have a minute, we'll show you a few pictures. We're not going to overdo it. Let me see if I can get this. And Mary got upset because a bunch of them are pictures of her, but they all have a background that will show you something. So
So they didn't hear where we went in Arkansas.
this old railroad trestle, I don't remember which place this is even. It's it's a place called Calico Rock, and there's an old trestle bridge back here. This is the White River there at Calico Rock. This is a place that we stayed for one night. That's a night scene there on the river. And the fog rises off the White River every night. It's just a beautiful place. Us, also at that same place that I have the night scene from. And again, it's just a beautiful place. We love being there.
It was north central Arkansas.
North Central Arkansas.
Almost to Missouri, right?
Yep, we stayed in that cabin for one night. This is a state park. There are a bunch of caverns that they discovered in 1973. And they're big caverns. And we went there to see the caverns, but they were sold out. They can't get enough people to work to have enough tour guides to run all the tours. But the water that you see below her comes rushing out of the mountainside in this place. Just beautiful.
And then a fun aside, the roads in Arkansas crack me up. First of all, there's no turtles on the roads or reflective things.
The reflective bumps, yeah.
And 85% of county roads are not paved. I'm calling Judge Garza and tell him if anybody complains, just tell him we're not in Arkansas, our county roads are paved.
Yeah, travel got a little tough at times. God, we have so many things to be thankful for. We recognize that, we see your hand, and that's the one gift. That's the thing I would ask today, is that you remind us to see your hand, not just in the world around us, but on us, that we have value to you, that we have work to do. And when things sometimes seem like they are going badly, how often those things move us to the place that we need to be to serve you, to bring your Hesed to this world. Show us that, open our eyes this week. Be with us, be with those we prayed for, with Phil and Cherie. We're so concerned, and we know what a tough time it is. But be with us this week. Guide us safely and bring us back next week. Amen.
Amen. You guys can unmute yourselves.